Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm so glad you're joining us again. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Today's story is one of trust, love, betrayal, and the powerful emotions that come with it. It's a story of a seemingly perfect life unraveling in unexpected ways, and I hope it resonates with you. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's tale. As I walked into the living room of our spacious home on the outskirts of the town of Brookhaven, I thought everything was normal. My wife, Lisa, and I had been married for 20 years, a marriage that was built on love, trust, and mutual respect. We had 3 children, our eldest, Tim, 18, and 2 younger daughters, Molly, 16, and Anna, 13. We lived a quiet life, tucked away in a house that we had worked hard to make our own, with a large yard where Tim often helped his father, Richard, with the farm. The world around us seemed like it was moving smoothly until one fateful day. Tim, like many young men, had always been a quiet, independent type. He was athletic, worked part-time, and kept mostly to himself. He didn't seem to have a girlfriend, at least not when he talked about, and I found it somewhat peculiar, considering his age. But his relationship with Lisa's sister, Diana, was something that always seemed a bit too close for comfort. Diana had been staying with us for the past few months, helping out after her recent divorce. At first, it seemed like a good arrangement. She could help with the kids, and Lisa was happy to have her around. I never really thought much about their closeness until recently. It started small. Tim would come home late after spending time with Diana, and Lisa would joke about their runs around the property in the mornings. I noticed that they would disappear for hours sometimes, and it struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. That was until the day I returned early from the grocery store to find the cabin on the edge of our property open, the lights on. At first, I thought maybe it was an oversight by the staff. But as I got closer to the cabin, I heard something I could never unhear. The unmistakable sound of people having sex. My heart stopped. My mind raced, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But as I stood there, frozen, I realized that it was Tim and Diana. I peered through the window, my body shaking, unable to process what I was seeing. I didn't know what to do. I felt a cold rush of disbelief. Surely, there had to be some mistake. How could this be real? But there they were, my son and my sister-in-law, engaged in an act that was not just inappropriate but unthinkable. I walked away in shock, not knowing how to face either of them. The next few days were a blur. I tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself that I had somehow imagined it. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. My son and Diana had been involved in something for months, something I couldn't wrap my head around. I needed answers. But I didn't know how to ask. Part 2, The Unraveling. After that day, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I kept telling myself that maybe it was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe they were just talking, maybe I'd walked in on something that had been blown out of proportion in my mind. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Tim and Diana were having an affair. I couldn't fathom how it had happened or what had led to this betrayal. Tim had always been respectful, quiet, he had his own life, but never once had I thought there would be any tension between him and Diana. I had to find out for sure. The next morning, after a restless night of tossing and turning, I confronted Lisa about it. I knew it would be painful, but I needed to talk to her before I spoke to Tim or Diana. She was in the kitchen, making coffee when I walked in, her usual smile lighting up her face. But I could tell something was off. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. Her eyes weren't as bright as they usually were. I wasn't sure if it was because of her sister staying with us, or if there was something else going on. Lisa, I began, my voice tight, I need to talk to you about something important. She raised an eyebrow, concerned. What's wrong, honey? I hesitated, unsure how to even begin. The words seemed stuck in my throat. But I couldn't avoid it any longer. It's about Tim and Diana. I think there's something going on between them. Lisa's face faltered for just a second. She didn't look shocked, not like I thought she would. In fact, she looked like she had already known. A strange, quiet silence filled the space between us, and I felt my stomach churn with a sickening dread. What do you mean? She asked slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. I took a deep breath and then said the words I'd been avoiding. I saw them together, Lisa. I saw them in the cabin. They were having sex. Her face turned pale, her lips parted, and for a moment she seemed lost for words. I could feel the tension in the room building, the air thick with the heaviness of the situation. Then she did something that I didn't expect. She sat down at the kitchen table, put her head in her hands, and let out a long, shaky breath. I've known, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I've known for months, but I didn't want to believe it. I thought I was just imagining things, or maybe I thought I was overreacting. But I've seen the way they act around each other. I just never thought it would go this far. My heart sank, a rush of anger and betrayal surging through me. I felt my hands clenching into fists. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say something sooner? I didn't know how, Lisa responded, tears now starting to spill from her eyes. I didn't want to believe it was happening. And part of me thought. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. I stood there, feeling like the world was closing in on me. Everything I had thought about our family, about our life, had suddenly shattered. The trust we had built, the life we had created, felt like it had all been a lie. I don't know what to do, Lisa, I said, my voice cracking. I'm at a loss. Do I confront Tim? Do I confront Diana? Do I tell your brother, my brother-in-law? She looked up at me, her face etched with anguish. I don't know. I honestly don't know what the right thing to do is. I'm just as lost as you are. But we can't let this tear us apart. We sat there in silence for a long while, neither of us knowing how to proceed. I was angry, confused, and heartbroken. And I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal not just from Tim, but from Diana too. She was part of our family, someone I had trusted, someone who had been welcomed into our home. And now this. Eventually, I knew we had to take the next step. We couldn't pretend this wasn't happening, and we couldn't avoid it any longer. We had to confront them. But what if it destroyed everything? What if we lost our son, our family? The fear of that gnawed at me, but I couldn't ignore the reality of the situation any longer. It had been 3 days since I stumbled upon that awful scene. I could hardly sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of Tim and Diana together. The doubt gnawed at me. I tried to distract myself with work, helping Richard on the farm, but the image wouldn't leave my mind. What did this mean? How long had this been going on? Was I truly just blind to it all? Lisa seemed happy, almost oblivious to my internal turmoil. She continued as though nothing had changed, talking about the baby we had been trying for, asking me if I was excited, but I couldn't bring myself to share in her joy. Instead, I was preoccupied, wondering if she was in on this somehow, if she had known. Could she have been hiding this from me too? I tried to act normal around her, but it was almost impossible. There was a disconnect between us now. I couldn't stop myself from noticing little things. Like how Diana would linger a bit too long when Tim would walk past her in the kitchen, or how they would always seem to have private conversations when no one was around. Lisa had been so focused on her own happiness with the pregnancy that she hadn't noticed the subtle changes, the way Tim had withdrawn from the family in a way that wasn't typical for him. I couldn't bear it anymore. I had to confront him, and I had to confront her. I decided to start with Tim. He'd always been a good kid, respectful and hardworking, but something had clearly changed. That morning, after breakfast, I found him outside, leaning against the fence, looking out at the field. It was a cloudy day, and the air was thick with anticipation. It seemed like the perfect time to talk. Tim, I said, my voice shaking. We need to talk. He didn't look at me at first, just nodded, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his body stiffened. About what, Dad? He asked quietly. You know what I'm talking about, I said, my stomach tightening. What's going on between you and Diana? He flinched. It was all the confirmation I needed. I had my answer before he even said a word. Dad, please, he began, but I cut him off. No, Tim. I need the truth. Right now. He hesitated, looking down at his shoes, and then took a deep breath. I never wanted you to find out like this, he muttered, his voice full of regret. It started last year, on her birthday. I felt my stomach twist. So it's been going on for a while now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tim nodded. We were both drunk. It happened once, and then it just kept happening. I never meant to hurt anyone, but it just... I don't know, Dad. It just happened. I stood there in shock. My son, my flesh and blood, had been betraying not just me, but the entire family. And now, with a few words, he had confirmed everything I feared. But why? Why her? Why Diana? What about Lisa? I asked, the words barely leaving my lips. What about your mom? I didn't want to hurt her, Tim said, his voice barely audible. She doesn't deserve this. But she doesn't know, okay? And I never meant to hurt you either, Dad. I didn't want any of this. Then why didn't you come to me sooner? I asked, struggling to keep my emotions in check. Why keep it a secret? I don't know, Tim admitted. I was scared. I didn't want to disappoint you or Mom. And I didn't know how to stop. I looked at my son, seeing a boy I once knew, but now I saw someone else, someone who had crossed a line he couldn't easily undo. A flood of anger, sadness, and betrayal swept over me. But I had to keep my composure. I had to know the full truth. And what about Diana? I asked. How do you explain her involvement in all of this? Tim's face darkened. She made the first move. I didn't know how to say no to her. I clenched my fists, struggling to hold back tears. I had trusted Diana. She was family, for heaven's sake. She had been staying with us for months, helping with everything. How could she do this to me, to Lisa, to the whole family? It didn't make sense. I need you to leave, I said, my voice hardening. I can't deal with you right now. Go to town. Go anywhere. Just get out of here. Tim looked at me for a long moment, his face filled with regret and fear. But he didn't argue. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. I spent the rest of the day replaying everything in my head. The lies, the secrecy, the questions. I hadn't even thought about what I would do next. I couldn't fathom confronting Diana yet, not after what Tim had told me. But the truth had to come out, and soon. Later that night, after dinner, I finally sat down with Lisa. I knew I had to tell her everything. I couldn't keep this secret from her any longer. I owed it to her, to our marriage, to our family. But as I prepared to speak, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still very wrong. Diana had been too involved, too eager to brush off the consequences. And Lisa? She hadn't suspected a thing. Could she really be that oblivious? Part 3, The Confrontation. It had been a restless night. Lisa slept soundly beside me, her steady breathing a stark contrast to the storm raging in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about Tim's confession. It felt like everything I thought I knew about my family, about my life, had been turned upside down. And now there was the other piece of the puzzle that still needed to be addressed, Diana. I had planned to wait until morning to confront Lisa, but I couldn't hold it in any longer. The weight of the secret was too much. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, I sat up, my heart heavy in my chest. I glanced at Lisa, still asleep, her face soft and peaceful. How could she not know? How could she be so unaware of what was happening right under her nose? I slid out of bed quietly, my feet hitting the cold wooden floor. I felt like a stranger in my own home. The house that once brought me comfort now felt suffocating. I walked downstairs, trying to gather my thoughts, but nothing seemed clear. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether to jump or step back. But one thing was certain, the truth had to come out. When Lisa woke up, we would talk. I had to tell her everything. I couldn't carry this burden any longer. A few hours later, Lisa finally emerged from the bedroom, looking groggy but happy. She smiled at me, a smile that should have been comforting, but instead it filled me with an overwhelming sense of guilt. She was so excited about the baby, so full of hope and joy. How could I destroy that? How could I ruin the future she was so eager to create for us? Morning, Lisa said, her voice cheerful. How are you feeling today? You look like you didn't sleep well. I didn't, I replied quietly. There's something we need to talk about. Her face immediately changed, her expression growing concerned. What's wrong? I hesitated. This was it. This was the moment. It's about Tim. And Diana, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Lisa's eyes widened in shock. What do you mean? What about Tim and Diana? I took a deep breath and told her everything. I explained what I had seen, the strange behavior I had noticed, Tim's confession, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal that had taken root in my heart. Lisa didn't speak for several long moments. She just stared at me, her face a mixture of disbelief and shock. You're sure? She asked finally, her voice trembling. Are you sure about all of this? I nodded. Yes. Tim confessed. He said it's been going on for months. He's been sneaking around with Diana behind our backs. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lisa's face went pale as the weight of my words sank in. She stood up and began pacing the room, her hands wringing together nervously. No. This can't be true, she said, almost to herself. Diana wouldn't. She wouldn't do something like that. She's family. I thought the same thing, I said, my voice cracking. But it's the truth. And now I need you to believe me. Lisa's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Instead, she ran a hand through her hair and stopped pacing. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know how to process this. Diana's been living here, helping us. She's been a part of our family. I know, I said, my voice tinged with frustration. I never thought this could happen. But it did. Lisa sat down slowly, her head in her hands. How could I have missed this? She asked, her voice muffled. How could I have been so blind? You weren't blind, Lisa, I said gently. You trusted Diana. We both did. But this is bigger than that. We can't ignore it anymore. For a long time, we sat in silence. The reality of what had happened, the betrayal, the lies, settled over us like a heavy fog. I wanted to comfort Lisa, but I didn't know how. I had never imagined I would be in a situation like this, caught between two people I loved, both of whom had broken my trust in unimaginable ways. Finally, Lisa looked up at me, her face wet with tears. What do we do now? She asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. How could I? The trust between us, between all of us, had been shattered. Diana wasn't just my sister-in-law, she was family. But the damage had been done. There was no going back. The truth was out and it had torn us apart. I don't know, Lisa, I said, my voice raw. But I think we need to talk to Diana. We need to confront her. I don't know if I can keep her in my life after this, but I think we deserve answers. Lisa nodded, wiping her eyes. You're right. We need to talk to her. But I don't know if I'm ready to face her. I understood. I wasn't ready either. But we couldn't avoid it anymore. We needed closure, we needed answers, and we needed to figure out how to move forward from this. Part 4, the confrontation with Diana. The weight of everything was unbearable. I hadn't realized how deeply this would shake me until I sat down in the living room, Lisa beside me, both of us awaiting the inevitable. The confrontation with Diana. The one person I never thought would betray us like this. She had been staying with us for months, helping Lisa as she navigated the ups and downs of pregnancy. She had been more than family, she was a trusted figure in our lives, and yet now everything was being stripped away. Lisa and I had agreed to confront her together. We couldn't let this fester. There was no way we could move forward without the truth, without understanding the full extent of what had happened. But as the hours passed, as we sat in silence waiting for Diana to return from her errands, I could feel the anxiety building. How was this conversation going to go? What was I supposed to say? How could I possibly address this calmly, knowing what I knew? Diana arrived around 6 p.m., looking as cheery as usual. She had a small smile on her face, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. I wondered if she could sense something was wrong. Maybe she knew on some level that her life was about to change forever. But when she saw Lisa and me sitting together on the couch, the tension in the air was palpable. She paused for a moment in the doorway, her eyes flicking between the two of us. Hey, everything okay? She asked, her voice light but edged with uncertainty. Lisa stood up first, taking a deep breath before responding. No, Diana, everything is not okay, she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet anger I hadn't heard before. I stood too, my heart racing in my chest. We need to talk, I said. About you and Tim. Diana's face went pale. The color drained from her skin, and for a split second I saw panic in her eyes. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by a calm, collected facade. She took a step back as if considering running, but instead she just stared at us. Tim, she asked, almost too casually. What do you mean about Tim? I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I couldn't back down. Not now. We know everything, Diana, I said, my voice hardening. We know about you and Tim. We know it's been going on for months. Her eyes flickered toward Lisa, but she didn't speak. The silence between us seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, Diana spoke, but her voice was barely above a whisper. I never meant for any of this to happen, she said, shaking her head. I never wanted to hurt you or Lisa. I was just, I don't know, confused. It started as a mistake, and then it just kept happening. I took a step closer. A mistake? You've been sleeping with my son for months, Diana. You think that's just a mistake? She visibly flinched at the harshness of my words. But she didn't look away. It wasn't like that, she said. It was just, he's always been so distant, and I've been going through my own things. He needed someone, and I don't know. It just happened. Does Lisa know? Does she know everything? I asked, my voice low but steady. Diana glanced nervously at Lisa, who was standing silently, her face flushed with anger. Lisa didn't speak for a moment, but her gaze never wavered. I didn't mean for any of this to come out like this, Diana said, tears starting to form in her eyes. I didn't plan on falling into this. I should have told you. I should have stopped. But I was too selfish. I felt the anger building inside me, but I kept it in check. Diana was trying to rationalize her actions, but I wasn't having it. Selfish? You've destroyed this family. You've ruined everything we've worked for, and for what? A fling with my son. Lisa's voice broke through the tension. Why did you have to do this, Diana? She asked softly, her voice trembling. Why couldn't you just be honest with us? Why did you have to keep lying? Diana's tears spilled over, and she wiped them away quickly. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you, Lisa. I just didn't know how to stop it. It was a mistake. A huge mistake. And I wish I could take it all back. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel my chest tightening, and I knew Lisa was struggling to hold herself together. She had been betrayed in the most painful way possible. By her own sister. By someone she trusted. Someone she thought of as family. I looked at Lisa, my heart breaking for her. We need to figure out what to do next. This can't go on. Lisa nodded, her eyes red from crying. I don't know what to do, she whispered. But we need to decide what's best for us. I don't know if I can forgive her. I don't know if I can ever trust her again. I looked back at Diana, my anger still simmering beneath the surface. You need to leave, Diana. You've done enough damage. Diana looked at me, her face crumpling with shame and regret. She nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for her things. She didn't say another word as she left the house, but the tension remained. As she walked out, I turned to Lisa. Are you okay? I don't know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I'll ever be okay again. Part 5. Picking up the pieces. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur of emotions. Diana left the house that night, her presence gone as if she had never been there. But her absence did little to ease the tension. Lisa and I spent most of those days in silence, each of us processing the storm that had just hit our family. It wasn't just the shock of Diana's betrayal. It was the hurt, the disbelief, and the pain of knowing that someone so close, someone we had trusted completely, had been hiding such a dark secret. I couldn't bring myself to reach out to Tim. He had left the house after our conversation, claiming he was staying at a friend's place. I wanted to be angry with him, but more than that, I felt a profound sense of loss. My son, the one who had always been my pride, my joy, had made a choice that had shattered everything. I couldn't believe how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Lisa, for her part, barely spoke. She moved through the motions, making dinner, taking care of the kids, and trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. But I could see the pain in her eyes, the anger, the disappointment. She was struggling, and I couldn't even begin to understand how she felt. The woman she had called her sister, the woman she had trusted with everything, had turned on her in the worst possible way. It was late one evening when I finally found the courage to speak to Lisa again. We had spent the whole day in silence, only exchanging a few words here and there. I knew she was hurting, and I knew I was too, but we couldn't move forward unless we talked about what had happened. We needed to face it head-on, for the sake of our family. I found her sitting in the living room, staring at the flickering television. She didn't look at me when I entered, but I could feel the weight of the moment. Lisa, I said softly, can we talk? She nodded without turning to look at me, and I took a seat beside her. The air between us felt thick with unspoken words, but I knew we couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. I'm so sorry, I said, my voice shaking. I never meant for any of this to happen. I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if I can. She finally turned to look at me, her face pale and tired. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something else in them, something that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, though I knew she had every right to be angry. It was more like a deep sadness, a hopelessness. You're not the one who needs to apologize, she whispered, her voice breaking. I trusted her, Richard. I trusted Diana with everything, and she betrayed me. She betrayed all of us. I reached out to take her hand, but she pulled it away gently. She was too hurt, too raw. I know, I said quietly. I feel the same way. But we have to figure out how to move forward. We have kids to think about. We can't let this destroy everything we've worked for. Lisa didn't say anything for a long time, and I let the silence stretch. I could see her mind working, processing everything that had happened. She was trying to figure out how to navigate this new reality just like I was. But I also knew that her pain was deeper than mine. Diana had been more than just a sister-in-law to her. She had been a confidant, a friend, someone she had leaned on during hard times. And now that trust was gone. We need to talk to Tim, Lisa said finally, her voice tight. He needs to know how much he's hurt us. How much he's hurt me. I nodded. I had been avoiding that conversation for days. I didn't know what I would say to my son. How could I look him in the eye and tell him how much he had destroyed? But I knew it had to happen. We couldn't move forward if we didn't confront him. We had to make him understand the magnitude of what he had done. The next morning we sat down with Tim. He had come home late the night before, and as much as I wanted to avoid this confrontation, I knew we couldn't put it off any longer. Lisa and I sat across from him at the kitchen table, the tension so thick I could almost feel it in the air. Tim looked at us, his face pale and his eyes filled with guilt. I could tell he had been crying, though he hadn't admitted it. He knew what was coming. Tim, Lisa began, her voice shaky but firm. What you did, what you and Diana did, it has torn this family apart. You've hurt your mother, you've hurt me, and you've hurt your sisters. You've broken the trust we've all worked so hard to build. Tim's eyes welled with tears, but he didn't say anything. I could see the shame in his face, but it wasn't enough. He had to understand the full extent of his actions. You don't get to make excuses for this, I said, my voice hardening. You don't get to act like this was just some mistake. You knew what you were doing. You knew it was wrong, and yet you kept going. I'm sorry, Tim whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Lisa shook her head, her voice trembling. But you did, Tim. You hurt us all. And you need to understand the consequences of what you've done. You've destroyed our family, and now you have to figure out how to fix it. Tim sat in silence, tears streaming down his face, but there were no more words. He had no excuses. He had no explanation. And for the first time I realized that the person sitting in front of me wasn't the son I had raised. He wasn't the boy I thought I knew. Part 6, The Aftermath. The days following our confrontation with Tim were some of the hardest of my life. There was no clear resolution, no simple way to fix the damage that had been done. The family I had spent so many years building was now fractured, the trust shattered in a way that felt irreparable. I had always believed that family was unbreakable, that we could weather any storm, but this was different. Lisa and I had tried to have normal conversations, tried to return to the routines that once brought us comfort, but every word felt hollow, every touch strained. The house, once a place of warmth, now felt cold. We ate meals in silence, went about our daily tasks without speaking much, each of us trapped in our own thoughts, each of us trying to process the weight of what had happened. Tim remained distant. He spent most of his time in his room, rarely emerging. I couldn't even bring myself to check on him. I didn't know what to say. The boy I had raised, the boy I had trusted, had betrayed everything we stood for. And now there was a part of me that wanted to cut ties with him completely. But Lisa, as hurt as she was, still held on to the smallest thread of hope. She believed that he could change, that he could learn from this mistake. I didn't know if I could share her optimism. I wanted to believe that things could go back to normal, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew that it was a fantasy. I could feel the weight of my own anger and resentment growing inside me like a poison. I had never been a violent man, but there were moments when I wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them both feel the pain I was carrying. But I held back. For Lisa. For the family. Because I knew that if I gave in to my anger, I would lose everything. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, something unexpected happened. It was a Thursday afternoon when Lisa told me she wanted to meet with Tim's therapist. I had never been a fan of therapy. I had always believed that family problems should stay within the family and that we could solve our issues on our own. But Lisa, ever the optimist, believed in the power of therapy to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. And for her, I agreed to go. We sat in the small office, Tim sitting beside us, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He didn't speak much, his eyes cast downward as if he was ashamed to even be there. The therapist, a middle-aged man named Dr. Phillips, was kind but firm. He asked us to share our feelings, to articulate what we had been through. I could see Tim squirming, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. He wasn't ready to face the full weight of his actions. But Lisa and I tried to open up. I feel like I failed as a parent, I said, my voice shaking. I've spent so many years teaching my son to value family, to value trust. And now all of that feels like it's been for nothing. Tim looked up at me, his eyes filled with guilt. I never meant to hurt you, Dad, he said quietly. I never wanted to ruin everything. I stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. Then why did you do it, Tim? Why did you let this happen? He didn't have an answer. He simply looked down again, unable to meet my gaze. The therapist stepped in, sensing the rising tension. It seems like there's a lot of unresolved guilt here, Dr. Phillips said. Tim, do you feel like you betrayed your family? Tim nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I do. I don't know why I did it, but I know I hurt everyone. And I don't know how to make it right. The therapist nodded, guiding the conversation forward. Lisa, Richard, what do you need from Tim right now? Lisa spoke softly, her voice filled with sadness. I need him to understand the consequences of his actions. I need him to understand that he didn't just hurt me, he hurt all of us. And I need him to take responsibility for what he's done. I need him to show me that he can learn from this. I nodded in agreement. And I need him to show that he's truly sorry, I said. I need him to prove that he can be trusted again. Because right now, I don't know if I can ever trust him the way I did before. Tim's face crumpled as the weight of our words hit him. I don't know if I can make that right, he said, his voice trembling. But I'll try. I promise I'll try. We spent the next hour talking through our emotions. The therapist guided us, helping us express the pain we were feeling. It wasn't easy, but by the end of the session I felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of our family. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption. As we left the therapist's office, I looked at Lisa. She had been quiet throughout the session, but I could see the resolve in her eyes. She wanted to believe that Tim could change, that he could make things right. I wasn't sure if I felt the same, but I had to try. For Lisa. For the kids. For the family we had worked so hard to build. Part 7. The Strain of Recovery. The weeks after the therapy session felt like a delicate balancing act. We had made some progress, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the damage was still there, lingering beneath the surface, waiting to resurface at the wrong moment. Lisa and I had been trying to find our footing, to reconnect in some way. I could see the cracks in our relationship, but I wasn't ready to admit it. We had been through too much, and the thought of letting go was unbearable. But even so, the tension was always there. Tim had started showing more effort after the session. He was quieter, more respectful, but there were moments when he'd look at me, his eyes full of regret and shame. I wanted to believe him when he said he was trying, but a part of me couldn't shake the doubt. How could I trust him again after everything? The trust that had once been so solid was now fragile, like glass, and I was terrified of it shattering once more. Lisa, on the other hand, had thrown herself into the pregnancy. She had to. It was the one thing she felt was still right in the world. And, in a way, it became our lifeline. We had the baby to look forward to. We had the hope of a new life, a fresh start, something to rebuild on. But I couldn't deny that the dark cloud of Tim's betrayal still hovered over us. It wasn't gone, and it wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, the house eerily quiet. Tim was out with his friends, and Lisa had gone to bed early, exhausted from the long day. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing again, like it always did when the house was still and silent. My thoughts were consumed with the same questions. Would Tim ever really change? Could I ever trust him the way I did before? What was left of the family we once had? I stood up, walking aimlessly around the house, my thoughts becoming a tangled mess. I looked out the window, staring at the empty yard that used to be filled with laughter and activity. Now it just felt empty, cold, and hollow. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine anymore. The foundation had cracked, and no amount of patching would make it whole again. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Lisa. I'm not sure what I feel anymore. I think we need to talk. Tomorrow. Please. I stared at the message for a long time, my heart sinking. I knew what this meant. It had been coming. We had been tiptoeing around the issue, pretending everything was okay, but deep down, we both knew it wasn't. Lisa was struggling too. I had seen it in her eyes, in the way she moved through the house, the way she smiled as if everything were normal. But nothing was normal anymore. I quickly typed a reply. I'll be up when you get home. We'll talk. I put my phone down and took a deep breath. I knew this conversation was coming, but I didn't know if I was ready for it. Was there a way back? Could we rebuild what had been destroyed? Or were we just holding on to something that had already slipped away? The next morning, I woke up early, but Lisa was already in the kitchen making coffee. She was unusually quiet, and I could sense the tension between us. She didn't even look at me when I walked in. It was as though the air was thick with unsaid words, the distance between us growing with each passing day. Lisa, are you okay? I asked, my voice soft. She finally turned to face me, her eyes tired but resolute. No, Richard, she said, her voice shaky. I'm not okay. And I think it's time we face the truth. The truth about us. I swallowed hard, bracing myself. What do you mean? She took a deep breath and walked over to the table, sitting down. I don't know if I can move past this, Richard. I don't know if I can forgive Tim. I don't know if I can forgive you for not seeing it sooner. I don't know if we can fix this. My heart sank. I had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, I didn't know what to say. I sat down beside her, my hands shaking. I'm sorry, Lisa, I whispered. I should have seen it. I should have known. But I was too busy. I didn't pay attention. She looked at me, her face filled with pain. I don't even know who I am anymore, Richard. How do I look at Tim the same way? How do I look at myself? How do I even trust you when I see what you've both done to me? I reached for her hand, but she pulled it away. I don't want to hear it right now. I need space to figure this out, she said. I need to figure out what I really want. I nodded, my throat tight. I understood. She needed time. We both did. But what scared me was that I didn't know if that time would be enough. I didn't know if it was possible to heal a wound so deep, a wound that had been inflicted not just by Tim, but by Diana and by the betrayal that had turned our entire world upside down. The following days were full of silence. Lisa withdrew into herself, spending more time in her room, away from the rest of the family. Tim had started coming home later, staying out with friends, avoiding any real conversation with either of us. I felt lost, not knowing how to fix things or if they could even be fixed at all. I tried to reach out to Tim to offer him support, but he just shrugged me off, not willing to open up. He hadn't truly grasped the gravity of what he had done. He thought everything would be fine if he just stayed quiet, if he just gave us some space. But the space was only making the situation worse. The more time we spent apart, the more distant we became. And the more distant we became, the harder it would be to put everything back together. I didn't know how long we could keep pretending that everything was okay. Part 8. Searching for answers. The silence between Lisa and me grew heavier with each passing day. I had never felt so alone in my own home. The house, which had once been filled with laughter and warmth, now seemed like a hollow shell. Even when we were in the same room, it felt like there was a vast, unspoken chasm between us. Lisa spent most of her time in her bedroom, and I did my best to avoid Tim, unsure of how to approach him without making things worse. The truth was, I was lost. I didn't know what to do next. I had tried to speak to Lisa again a few times, but each attempt had been met with silence, or worse, defensiveness. She wasn't ready to talk. I didn't blame her. I wasn't ready either. The weight of the betrayal still hung heavy in the air, and no amount of words could take away the hurt. Lisa's pregnancy should have been the light at the end of this tunnel. A new life was growing inside of her, something that should have brought us together. But instead, it felt like the pregnancy was a reminder of everything we had lost. It was like a shadow that loomed over us, promising a fresh start while also reminding us of our fractured family. It was supposed to be a blessing, but all it did was highlight the emotional void between us. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I had to try. I couldn't keep living like this in a house full of people but feeling completely isolated. I reached out to Tim. He had been avoiding me, but after a few days of silence, he finally responded to my text. "Meet me at the farm tonight. Please." It was a simple request, but I was desperate for any kind of closure. I didn't know if Tim was ready to face the truth or if he even understood the severity of what he had done. But I knew that I needed to hear it from him. I needed to hear him take responsibility. That evening, I waited at the farm. The field stretched out before me, the wind rustling through the tall grass. Tim arrived just after sunset, his car rolling up the gravel driveway with a slow, steady hum. He stepped out, his posture stiff, his eyes cast downward. He was no longer the carefree teenager I had raised. The weight of his actions had changed him. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice low. "You wanted to talk?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah. We need to talk about what happened, Tim. I can't keep pretending everything's fine. I don't think you realize just how much you've hurt this family." He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding mine. "I know," he said quietly. "I know I messed up. I don't know what came over me. I never meant to hurt you or Mom." I crossed my arms, trying to keep my voice steady. "Then why did you do it? Why did you let it go on for so long? Why didn't you tell us?" "I don't know," Tim admitted, his voice shaking. "It started so fast and then... I don't know. It just kept going. I don't know how to explain it. I wasn't thinking. It was selfish, and I don't know why I let it go on." His words didn't make it any easier to digest. The rational side of my brain understood what he was saying. But the father in me still felt betrayed. My son had betrayed the very core of what we stood for. He had broken the trust that had been built over years. I couldn't shake that feeling. And no matter how sorry he seemed, the damage was done. "Do you understand what you've done?" I asked, my voice rising. "You've broken this family, Tim. You've hurt your mother, you've hurt your sisters. And you've hurt me. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." Tim's face crumpled. "I'm sorry," he repeated over and over again. "I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to make it right." I looked away, my heart heavy with sadness. "I don't know if you can, Tim. I don't know if anyone can. I need time to think. I need space. And I need you to understand that this may never be the same again." He nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I get it, Dad. I understand. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I stood there, staring at my son, at the boy I once thought I knew. I wasn't sure what the future held for us. I didn't know if we could ever return to the family we were. And I didn't know if I would ever be able to forgive him. But one thing was clear, he had to take responsibility for his actions. And if we were going to move forward, it had to start with him. When I returned home, I found Lisa in the kitchen, sitting in the dim light. She didn't look up when I entered. She hadn't asked about the conversation with Tim. She hadn't said much at all since that morning. But I knew she was waiting for something. She was waiting for me to have answers, for me to tell her what had happened, what was going to happen next. I didn't know what to say. The truth was, I didn't have the answers. All I had were questions. Could we rebuild? Could we ever trust him again? And more than anything, could we ever heal from the damage that had been done? I talked to him, I said softly, breaking the silence. Lisa looked up at me. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else there too, something that I couldn't quite understand. And? I took a deep breath. He's sorry. He doesn't know how to fix it. He says he messed up, but I don't know if that's enough. Lisa nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. I don't know if it is either. Part 9, A New Beginning. The days after my conversation with Tim were both agonizing and necessary. The heaviness in the house remained, the air thick with unspoken words and unhealed wounds. Lisa and I barely exchanged more than a few sentences a day. I could see the internal struggle she was going through. She wanted to be hopeful. She wanted things to go back to how they were before Diana, before Tim's betrayal. But we both knew, deep down, that there was no going back. The family we once were could never be fully restored, no matter how much we wished for it. Tim had left the house, not out of anger but out of guilt. He went to stay with a friend, giving Lisa and me the space we needed to think. At first, I had felt abandoned, as though he was running away from his responsibility. But I had to remind myself he was still a young man trying to make sense of the mess he had created. And even though the damage was severe, there was still hope that he could come to understand the gravity of his actions. It was a week before I was able to sit down with Lisa again. The distance between us, emotionally and physically, had been hard to bear, but I couldn't live in silence any longer. I knew that if we were going to have any chance of moving forward, we had to face the situation head-on, together. One evening, after dinner, I found her in the living room, staring out the window. The house was quiet, the kids long since gone to bed. It felt like a good moment to finally talk, to lay everything out on the table. Lisa, I began softly, taking a seat beside her. I know this has been hard. And I know we've both been struggling. But I think we need to figure out where we go from here. We can't keep living like this. She didn't say anything right away, but I could see the tears brimming in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, as if to keep her strength. I've been thinking, Richard, she said quietly. And I know things can't go back to how they were. But I don't want to give up on our family. I don't want to give up on you, and I don't want to give up on Tim. I took her hand in mine, the weight of her words settling in my chest. Lisa, I don't know if I can ever trust him the way I used to. The betrayal was too deep. But I know that we have to try, for our sake, for the sake of the kids. We need to heal, and that will take time. But it can't happen if we stay stuck in this anger. We have to let go of the hurt as much as we can. Lisa nodded, but there was a sadness in her expression that I couldn't ignore. I don't know if I can forgive him, Richard. I just don't know. I don't know if I can either, I admit it. But I do know that he's our son. And despite everything, I want to try to help him understand the weight of his actions. We can't let him keep running from this. He needs to face what he's done and make amends. But we also need to give him time. He's still our son, and no matter how angry we are, we can't just shut him out forever. For the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of hope in Lisa's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was there. The thought of forgiveness, the possibility of rebuilding, felt like a distant dream, but it was a dream nonetheless. We couldn't change what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, we could start rebuilding. We decided to reach out to Tim and ask him to come back for a family meeting. He came home a few days later, looking nervous and unsure of what to expect. The tension was still palpable, but there was a shared understanding between the three of us that we needed to face this together, for better or for worse. When Tim sat down at the kitchen table, I could see that he had changed. He was no longer the boy who thought everything was a joke. He was a young man, burdened with guilt, trying to make sense of the consequences of his actions. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Tim said, his voice trembling. But I'm so sorry. I can't take back what I've done, and I know I've hurt you both. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. Lisa and I exchanged a glance. I could see the pain in her eyes, but there was something else there too. A glimmer of the woman I had fallen in love with, a woman who still believed in redemption, who still believed in second chances. I'm not sure we can ever go back to how things were, Tim, Lisa said softly. But we can start with trying to heal. We can start by working on rebuilding our trust. That's all we can do right now. Tim nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. I understand, Mom. I'm not asking for everything to be okay right away. But I'll do my best. I'll prove to you both that I can change. The weight that had hung over us for so long didn't disappear instantly, but in that moment we were all on the same page. We couldn't undo what had been done, but we could start the long process of healing. We could start to rebuild what had been shattered. As weeks turned into months, things slowly began to improve. There were still difficult days when the anger would resurface, when the pain felt too much to bear, but we were learning how to cope, how to communicate, and how to support each other. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but we were moving forward. The healing process was slow, but it was happening. Tim was working hard to rebuild our trust. He had started seeing a counselor and was committed to addressing the issues that led him down this destructive path. Lisa and I were also working together to heal as a couple. We spent time talking, really talking, about our fears, our frustrations, and our hopes for the future. It wasn't easy, but every small step felt like progress. And then, one evening as Lisa and I sat in the living room watching the sunset together, we realized something. We had made it through. The road had been long, the pain real, but we had made it through the hardest part. The family was still broken, but it wasn't beyond repair. There was still love, still hope, still the possibility of healing. As we held hands in the quiet of our home, I knew that while we would never be the same, we had a chance to create something new. We were stronger, wiser, and more determined to never let betrayal tear us apart again. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. It's a journey of pain, redemption, and ultimately healing. Sometimes life throws us curveballs, but it's how we handle them that defines us. If you liked this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, take care.